Hey guys, welcome back to AP Biology Unit 7 Natural Selection. I just want to say thank you guys so much for the support. It means so much to me. When I read your comments, I feel super happy that I'm helping you guys out, and I hope to continue doing so. So alright, let's get started. So what are we going to cover? Well, you already know, we're going to go through each of the units in natural selection. And I see it looks like a lot, but trust me, we'll get through it really quick because each unit doesn't actually cover too much ground. Okay, so Introduction to Natural Selection and Natural Selection. So let's look at Darwin's theory of natural selection. In Darwin's theory, he says that overpopulation results in competition and struggle for existence. So when a region is overpopulated, the resources in the region are struggled over, and therefore competition arises between interspecies and between different species. Populations grow exponentially and overpopulate, exceeding the resources, and therefore drop back down below the carrying capacity. Populations contain variances and unequal fitness. So like every time an organism reproduces, the offspring is not a genetic copy of the parents. It actually has its own variations along with mutations and different combination of alleles, giving each of them an unequal fitness due to the environment at the time. For example, if there was a disease and one animal actually contained the genes to counteract that disease, it would have a higher fitness or ability to survive and reproduce than the others. Also, his theory covered that best fit individuals survive and get to pass on their traits to offspring. This creates the gradual change in the traits of a population over time. And finally, evolution occurs as advantageous traits accumulate in a population. Whew. Okay, so some types of selection. First is stabilizing selection, in which it eliminates the extremes and reduces variance and makes a tall peak. So in this case, you can see, let me get my pointer out. Before, the population was kind of distributed normally throughout the entire this range of traits. For example, this might be red, this might be darker, this might be lighter, like fur color. But over time, this specific allele of red was more advantageous, and therefore it led to stabilizing selection, which created a tall peak and made it much lower in other areas. Diversifying selection is when extremes grow and intermediates decrease. So it may lead to two new species. So for example, if this was our original population, again we'll use color. And let's say right here is red, and this is darker red, and this is lighter red. Those animals who had red fur color weren't able to survive as well as those that had really dark or really light. Therefore, the ones that had just regular red color died off, while those who had lighter or darker actually were more fit and therefore survived to pass on those traits, creating this diversifying trend. Next is directional selection. So the entire population of phenotype shifts away from one due to a change in the allele frequency. For example, the red pepper moths, they used to be, the bark used to be white and clean. So they would actually be around here. So say if this was the white trait. However, over time, due to the Industrial Revolution, factories started putting out smog by metric buttloads. Therefore, the frequency actually shift from a white moth color to a black moth color, and this directional selection shows how the allele frequencies change over time. There's also sexual selection, in which selection is based on variations in trait used to make males attract females. For example, in the peacock, the males are actually brightly colored, which are supposed to attract females, and some males say if they are better colored than others, will attract females, and therefore their trait will be passed on. Not due to the environment, but just simply due to the fact that they're better at mating. Sexual dimorphism, like I said with the peacocks, are differences in appearances between male and female. So like the male has colorful feathers to attract the female, and the female would actually have gray and dull colors for the feathers on the peacock. Okay, artificial selection. So humans basically breed organisms for desired traits like dogs, horses, wheat, and corn. The genetic engineering of crops result in GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. So these are good examples. The wild mustard, it's hard to believe, but it's true. Actually, they were breeded by humans to make cabbage, broccoli, cauliflower, kale, and kohlrabi. Basically, by by changing up the genotype. We actually can now genetically modify the organism by actually going into their genes. But at this time, they would actually mate with other plant species and basically see what came out. They had a good idea, but it wasn't perfect. Also, the gray wolf, which is a common ancestor. Over time, we breeded wolves, or technically now dogs, to how we wanted it, and over time became hundreds of species of these animals. Okay, population genetics. So, some population genetics will basically cover the different ways populations change over time. Sorry, that was my phone. How populations change over time. First, we go off with genetic drift, which is basically a change in the holy, give me a second. I should really put this under necessary. Okay, so genetic drift is the change in gene pools due to chance. The bottleneck effect is when there's a large population, however a natural disaster or some random occurrence actually minimizes that size of the population, meaning that vast genetic diversity shown by all these different colors, brightly colors, due to a natural disaster are left to a smaller population, and then over time this smaller genetic variance repopulates and we lose so much of the original genetic variation we had. This is called the bottleneck effect. And these populations are more susceptible to future natural disasters because they do not have the adaptations of genetic diversity in order to fight off these the changing environment. Next is the founder effect. Again, this is also genetic drift. As a small portion of this population becomes isolated, for example, birds flying to a new island, and then over time these birds will actually populate the island, and again we see that it has much less genetic diversity over time. Gene flow is the movement of alleles in or out of the population due to migration. So if new birds came into the population with a different genetic composition, they would add genetic diversity to the population, whereas if some of these left, they would remove genetic diversity. Mutations also cause genetic diversity as they are changes in the genetic material due to mistakes in code. It leads to an increase in genetic diversity. Non-random mating is where individuals choose their mate for specific reasons, and this eliminates less fit seeming individuals. And of course, natural selection. Okay, so Hardy-Weinburg equilibrium. So a lot of people have a confusion on this, so I'll take my time. We'll go over an example, and hopefully it helps out. Okay, so the conditions you need to use for the Hardy-Weinburg equilibrium. You need to have a very large population, so it can't be just a couple hundred organisms, it has to be a couple thousand. They also have to be isolated from other populations, so that you can't have any migration or immigration. Also, there must be completely random mating, so a male and a female cannot choose each other due to a specific trait. It must be completely random. There should be no mutations in the population and no natural selection occurring. What's interesting is that these conditions will never occur. It's impossible, but we still use it for inferences. It's weird, but you get it. The only things that actually could be possible is a very large population and isolation. Random mating could be possible, but typically not, and these two are just not possible. There's always mutations, there's always natural selection occurring, and that's why this is completely impossible. Okay, so the Hardy-Weinburg equilibrium is actually made of two parts. The first part is P plus Q equals 1, and then the second part is P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1. In these cases, P is the proportion of the dominant allele in the population, and Q is the proportion of the recessive allele in the population. So if there's two alleles, it's obvious, this one makes sense, because if there's, for example, 75% dominant allele of the population and 25% recessive allele, then 0.75 plus 0.25 will always equal 1. Okay, so let's look at a closer look. In this formula, it makes sense because if there's only two alleles in the population, then adding them must consist of the entire population, or 1, and that makes sense because there's only a recessive and a dominant. For this equation, P squared plus 2PQ plus Q squared equals 1, each of these represent a specific proportion in the population. P squared is a proportion of heterozygous dominant. Remember that P stands for the proportion of dominant alleles. So the amount that would have two dominant alleles would be P squared. Q squared is the proportion of homozygous recessive, and again, Q stands for the proportion of the population that is recessive, that has a recessive trait. Therefore, Q squared must be those who are homozygous for that recessive trait. Also, this is supposed to say homozygous. I am so sorry. Let me cross that out just to make sure. Homozygous. Okay, that was super bad handwriting. It's okay, let's just go on. 2PQ is the proportion of heterozygous individuals in the population. So again, P is the proportion of dominant alleles, Q is the proportion of recessive alleles, therefore 2PQ would equal the proportion of heterozygous individuals. Okay, so let's look at this question. Salmon fin, we'll use what we've learned in this question. Salmon fin color blue is a recessive trait, while gray is dominant. If the proportion of individuals who have blue fins is 0.3, what proportion of the population is heterozygous for gray fins? So first we'd use the equation. We know we'd have to use the equation p squared plus 2pq plus q squared, because they give us the proportion of individuals who have blue fins. And since we knew blue is a recessive trait, then for the individual 0.3 of the population have both little or b or little b recessive for blue fins. So blue is recessive, so it would only show if the individual was homozygous recessive. So we need to use q squared. So now we know that q squared equals 3, because q squared represents the part of the population that it has blue fins. And we take the square root of both sides, and we get that q equals 0.55. But we're not done. The question is actually looking for the proportion of heterozygous individuals. So the 2pq portion of this this problem. We know q, but how do we find p? Well, that's where the other equation comes into handy. So, since we know that q equals 0.55, and we know that p plus q equals 1, we just substitute in 0.55 for q, and then we get p plus 0.55 equals 1, so p must equal 0.45, because we subtracted 1 minus 0.55. So now we have all the information we need. We know that p is 0.45 and q is 0.55. So the proportion of population which is heterozygous for gray fins, so remember the heterozygous portion is found by 2pq, equals 2 times 0.45 times 0.55, which equals 0.495. And that is the proportion of the population that is heterozygous for gray fins, around half the population. Okay, I hope that helps out. If you want to replay that part, go ahead. If you have any questions, please leave comments. I promise you I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Okay, 7.6, Evidence of Evolution. Evidence 1. The fossil record shows the first species and how they change over time. So, as we know that fossils are actually hidden in the ground in layers as rock layers formed over time. Archaeologists actually found that those in the bottom rock layer, which were billions of years ago, over time those same species are found with differences, proving that evolution had occurred. Comparative biochemistry, which means they have the same biochemical pathways. Also, we all follow the same, we use the same central dogma, and we have the same nucleic acids and DNA. And molecular biology, similar amino acids and proteins. I got ahead of myself. Yeah, like we have the same nucleotide bases in our DNA, like adenine, guanine, cytosine, thymine. And we follow the same translation transcription pathway, where we go from DNA to RNA to protein, etc. Okay, and evidence number 4 is comparative anatomy. So we find homologous structures, analogous structures, and vestigial structures within animals, and we know that they came from each other, or they evolved over time. Homologous structures they have common origin or ancestry, even if the function varies. So for example, the tail of cats, monkeys, rats, not rates, they have a common ancestor, but they have different uses. Monkeys actually use their tails to grab onto things, soil, and trees. Cats use it to whack humans. Analogous structures, they have no origin, but they evolved similarly due to similar environmental pressures. So bats and birds both have wings, but they have no common ancestry. They both developed wings due to the situation they were in, and that having wings would actually, and the ability to fly, would actually benefit their survival. Vestigial structures are structures from a common origin, but they don't have any use anymore. So the whale has a hind leg bone that serves no function anymore, and the human, or us, we have tailbones that have that have no use. We have no use for it. Common ancestry. So a common ancestor is a common parent species of new species. So basically what you'll need to know for the AB exam is that the question might ask you to identify the common ancestor of, for example, the human and the chimpanzee. We can look right in this area and say this is the species at this intersection is the common ancestor of these two species. If it was the human and the baboon, it would be right here. If it was the common ancestor of all these organisms, it would be right there. So then that's basically what you'll have to do. They might ask you to circle it for an F or Q, and or know what common ancestor is. Continuing evolution. So in evolution, there are actually three types that we can talk about. Divergent evolution is where one species, due to some kind of isolation, for example, physical isolation, like a mountain range, they eventually, on both sides of the mountain, due to the different conditions, they will evolve separately into their own species. Convergent evolution, where two species are different, however, due to a similar environment, they actually converge into one species. This is actually extremely rare. And then parallel evolution is where both species are different species and they take the same path of evolution because they have similar environments. Coevolution is when two interacting species adapt with each other to survive, like a predator-prey relationship or symbiotic ones. It's like the wolf and the deer. As the wolf population increases, the deer decreases, and because the deer population decreases, the wolves have no more food, and therefore their population decreases. And as theirs decrease, the deer then increase again, and both of these continue this oscillation pattern until they have some external force effect on them. And then adaptive radiation, which is the emergence of numerous species from a common ancestor in a new environment. For example, if the finch, like Darwin studied, if they were introduced to a new island, that island has a bunch of different niches, such as forest area or lake area or plain lands. And because these areas are not already filled in by animals that are already living there, this species of finch will actually diversify into different species to fit each of the different niches. Alright, phylogeny and how to read that. Again, this is what we talked about earlier. Over time, this is the common ancestor, and over time they would actually split out or branch out into different species. This line right here is basically the finch line you can think of, and it's all the species that occur today. There could be another branch in here, for example, the baboon. If we have another monkey that actually stems up here, this would be their common ancestor, and that's basically how you read it. Whew, speciation, we're almost there. Okay, so when two organisms cannot reproduce, they have undergone speciation and are now two different species. There's two types of speciation: allopatric speciation, which is caused by geographic isolation, like I said, a mountain range, or an earthquake which has torn apart an island, or the occurrence of a river. Sympatric speciation is through things like polyploidy, in which an organism has more than two N chromosomes and therefore can only mate with those of the same ploidy or same chromosome number. Habitat isolation, so the species live in the same area but have different habitats. They rarely overlap. So one might be up in the trees while one might live on the ground. Therefore, they rarely ever interact with each other. Behavioral isolation, they started to behave differently, like different mating calls, which leads to no reproduction as they do not mate with one another. Temporal isolation is when they wake up or sprout at different times in the year. So maybe hibernation, one hibernates while one is getting food, and then that one hibernates when the other one wakes up. And then reproductive isolation, which is basically closely related species are unable to mate due to genitalia or the shape, or etc. Prezygotic barriers are those preventing mating from ever happening, and postzygotic barriers are those that happen after mating. So for example, the zygote, or the combination of the female egg and the male sperm, does not form a viable zygote. Extinction. So most species to have ever existed on this earth are extinct. There have been 7 mass extinctions to date, like the ones of the dinosaurs, and the scientists still warn of an 8th one due to humans and how fastly we're using up the planet. Okay, so some variations in populations. Balanced polymorphism is the presence of 2 or more forms of trait in a species. Each morph is advantageous in its own environment. geographic variation, which is basically different varieties of organisms due to the geographic location of that organism. Sexual reproduction, this includes independent assortment, sorry, I'm going a little too fast. Genetic variation due to sexual reproduction. Some things that during sexual reproduction this causes genetic variation is the independent assortment of chromosomes, crossing over or recombination, random fertilization, and we'll talk about all this more in genetics if you want to check that out. Unit 6, I believe. I can go over them really quickly though. Independent assortment is basically that chromosomes will, each allele of a trait will split differently. Crossing over, those chromosomes will actually cross over and switch over similar DNA in meiosis 1. And then random fertilization, there's millions of sperm, one egg, one of the sperm will fertilize that egg, and it could be random. Outbreeding is very dissimilar or unsimilar organisms in the same species breed. Heterozygous advantage is that sometimes the heterozygote genotypes are more fit than others, preserving both alleles. Now that's really interesting, but people with sickle cell, for us it's a bad trait, but for other species with that certain heterozygotes, they actually have a protection against malaria. And then frequency-dependent selection, predators prey on what looks like their prey. The most prominent phenotypes develop prey images, so the different rare individuals are less preyed upon and therefore more likely to survive. Okay, so the origin of life on Earth. I think this is the last one. My throat is getting so dry. Okay, early atmospheres had CH4, NH3, CO, CO2, N2, and H2O, but no oxygen. So it had lots of UV rays. Two scientists, Oparin and Hadeline, hypothesized separately that under conditions of early Earth, organic molecules could form and there would be no oxygen to degrade them. Stanley Miller and Harold Urey actually tested this hypothesis and proved that any energy could have synthesized organic molecules. Sidney Fox was actually able to create membranes out of organic molecules. The theory of endocyte symbionts is that chloroplasts and mitochondria were free-living organisms until taken up by large prokaryote, and beneficial symbiosis kept the reaction going. Some evidence of this is that the chloroplasts and the mitochondria have their own DNA, and that the DNA is more prokaryotic and not wrapped in double membrane like one of the cells, and therefore it proves that it was taken by endocytosis. Okay, thank you guys so much for watching. I really hope this helped. I appreciate all the support, and if you're a new watcher, please subscribe below. Trust me, it helps me out so much more than you could ever know. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next time.